participants in our future. Like, the future isn't set. It's not this thing on the horizon that we're all hurtling towards, helpless to do anything about. The fact of the matter is the future is made every day by the actions of people. And one of the big things that we can do is have conversations. Conversations about the future that we want, and also conversations about the future that we don't want. And I wrote about this in a book. It's a textbook called Science Fiction Prototyping Designing the Future with Science Fiction. And I went and talked to this guy by the name of Cory Doctorow because I thought, here's a guy who's a science fiction author, yes, very good science fiction author, but also an activist, an agenda, a person who has a vested stake and is very passionate about the future and actually uses fiction and nonfiction to, I believe, actually shape and try to change the future. So we sat down and started talking about this. So Cory, when you engage in your writing, when you engage what you do, how do you think about the future? How do you engage with the future? I mean, a lot of your fiction actually presents us very plausible futures, but you have a very clear intent. So I guess I think about the future allegorically. Unlike you, I have no pretense to predicting or making any kind of statement about what the future might be. But for me, the future acts like is like a really interesting petri dish for talking about things. You know, when you think someone might have a throat infection, you take a little swab off their throat and you put it in a medium, and whatever's there grows and gets to the point where you can visibly see it in a microscope. And I think when you're worried about something in the world, you can grab a little sample of it and put it in a story and grow it to the point where it's big enough to see it. So, you know, you once said to me, there's no such thing as a car, there's just robots we ride in these days. And I like to think that there's no such thing as a robot, there's just computers that walk around. And there's no such thing as a car, there's just a computer you ride in. And there's no such thing as a plane, there's just a computer you fly in. And then the robots are laptops with legs.
Yeah, robots are laptops with legs, thank you, yeah. So I think that what we do to the design of computers affects everything. And I think that there are a lot of areas in which what computers can do are contentious. You know, whether that's people worried about copyright, or people worried about child pornography, or people worried about terrorism, or people worried about weapons of mass destruction. There's a lot of people out there who have a beef with the idea of a computer that can run any program you can think of. And the problem is that as soon as we start messing with that, it has a knock-on effect on everything that we do with computers, which is everything. I mean, I'm a member of the Walkman generation. All of you are either a member of the Walkman generation or the iPod generation or both. We will all have hearing aids before long. Those hearing aids won't be little bits of plastic with an analog circuit in them, they'll just be computers. And so you're going to have a computer, at least one computer in your body, if you live long enough for the hearing damage you've inflicted on yourself to catch up with you. What we do in the name of securing computers from terrorists will affect hardware that runs inside your body in the next 30 or 40 years. Getting people to think about that in a way that is not an abstract kind of dry discussion, but has some blood in it, requires narrative. You know, think about it. Imagine it's like 1948. George Orwell sitting in his room writing 1984, and hasn't published it yet. No one's read it, and someone comes up to you and says, "Well, what's wrong with surveillance? How bad can it get? What objection do you have to surveillance?" And you can have this kind of abstract discussion about, you know, what impact on your behavior a camera might have, what impact on your ubiquitous tracking of your behavior might have, how that might change your relationship with each other and the state and so on. And, you know, maybe you convince people and maybe you wouldn't. It'd be a long and fairly dry conversation. A couple, 3 years later, or now 50, 60 years later, that 1984 exists, we have a word. We have Orwellian. And when someone says, what's wrong with surveillance and what's the problem with ubiquitous surveillance, we have a shortcut that we can use to import an entire narrative. It's a pretty visceral one. I mean, 1984 is a pretty visceral book. Orwellian. Just that tells you the whole story in one go and changes the argument.
Yeah, I think I think you're right that you can even say something like Big Brother. You see people use it, and what's really fascinating about that book, and when really good science fiction with intent of actually making change moves from being just fiction to move into culture. And like you say, and when people say, oh, I don't want that, oh, that's like Big Brother, I mean, you said that's an incredibly complex idea, but now we staked it. We said, this thing over here, I do not want that. And that's very important.